Africa and the world, thank you immensely for joining us on this weekend edition of Talking Point over your Pan-African channel. Today we are focusing on a discussion held by Professor PLO Lumumba, of a Kenyan scholar, with regards to Africa's constitutions. Of course, he said or cited on Wednesday that Africa's constitutions is being assaulted by different institutions. Well, the Kenyan scholar and Pan-Africanism activist Professor Patrick Otiento Lumumba has recently affirmed that African constitutions are invaluable or invaluably under assault by different powers. He was speaking in Monrovia on Wednesday, May 8, 2024. And Dr. Lumumba stated that these powers want to change African constitutions to have Africa democratized, an agenda entirely unknown to Africans. Addressing the International Association of Judges Conference, Professor Lumumba suggested that achieving judicial independence is not merely a matter of institutional design. It is worthy of note that the conference is being held under the theme Building Integrity Through Positive Action, a means of ensuring an independent judiciary. According to the great Kenyan scholar, Africa does not have a constitution that reflects its culture and tradition of its continent as well as its people. Therefore, he suggested that Western powers define and tell Africa what the constitution is and what it entails, something he said has placed the continent in crisis. However, he disclosed that before the 19th century, Africa had a constitution that mirrored different African traditions as well as cultures that the people could identify with, re-echoing that after the colonial rule in Africa, he noted that the African continent was again forced to formulate a constitution demanded by the Western power. Ladies and gentlemen, if you're just joining us, this is Talking Point, where we shall be unpacking this and more in the course of this edition. Stay with us. Beautiful televiewers of your Pan-African channel, beautiful listeners of your Pan-African channel, if you're just joining us, this is Talking Point over for you Media Africa. But today on this edition of the program, we shall be discussing a statement made by Kenyan scholar and Pan-Africanist activist PLO Lumumba while in Monrovia, Liberia, where he spoke about African constitutions. This was during the International Judges Conference in that part of the continent, where he said African constitutions have been meddled by different institutions. Of course, to evoke this topic of discussion, we've been joined by Professor AKHUMBOM Anthony, who is a Pan-Africanist, a civil society activist, and he doubles as a political analyst. Greetings to you, sir. You're welcome to today's edition.
Thank you very much, NJIX, and good afternoon to Cameroonians, good afternoon to Africans all around the globe. And it's a pleasure being here today to discuss about Africa, because it is indeed a passion when we talk about Africa and how to advance Africa.
Exactly, it's all about advancing the African continent. Meanwhile, while we dig deeper into the statement made by PLO Lumumba, he mentioned something which I'd like to capitalize on. African constitutions do not apply to the current status quo. Do you agree with that?
I actually wanted to say Africa didn't need constitutions like we have today, but for the sake of the so-called democracy, yes, they have constitutions, but these constitutions do not actually reflect the state of issues. Like he said, different powers are assaulting the constitutions of their different nations. That is very true. You see, when you look at the constitutions of the different African countries, you realize that they are primarily a copy and paste constitution, which does not reflect the very environment or structure in which they put in place does not resemble the people. It doesn't have anything to do with the kind of way the people want to be governed. And so that is really a problematic issue. But coming back, you realize that from one nation to the other in Africa, these so-called constitutions actually do not play the role of a constitution. Because what is a constitution? A constitution is supposed to be the highest law of the land that actually determines the operating dynamics of the country.
Exactly.
That defines the functioning, the government defines everything about a country. But look at it. Most of those who come to power pretending to respect these constitutions, for example, I want to use Cameroon, which is a nation that has a constitution that was rewritten in 1996 and amended in 2008. When you look at the constitution primarily defined how the nation is supposed to be run and the structure that is supposed to run the country. But do you know what? It took over 20-something years to put these structures into place. And what happened that the constitution could not be put into play the moment it was written? That is because some unscrupulous politicians actually want to take advantage and do things the way they want. And just imagine, for more than 20 years, a constitution had not been put into play, then it was re-amended in order to favor a politician to stay in power. That makes it actually disturbing, getting to realize that the constitution to them actually has no meaning. It's not a document that is respected. It does not reflect the power that it's supposed to possess. As I said, it's supposed to be the highest law of the land, and there is nobody who is above the law. The constitution is above every other thing. In the constitution of Cameroon and of many other nations, you realize it defines that in the government you have 3 arms, and automatically you realize that the executive is a separate arm from the judiciary, as well as supposed to be from the legislative. But what happens? The executive is supposed to have a provisional power to appoint judicial members, but he should not have authority over the judicial members. But in Cameroon, it's a different thing, because the executive seems to be playing the ball the way he wants to play, and that is the same thing in many African countries. And that is why, if you look at it, some of us, we term it to be a lot of constitutional coup d'etats take place in many African countries, where constitutions are not respected. Individuals rise above constitutions, they play and do what they want, and at the end of the day control the people. So what are we saying? Africans are actually experiencing what I want to call a kind of dictatorship in most of their nations, because their constitutions do not, in fact, they do not respect the constitutions.
Yes, exactly. We've been seeing what Professor Lumumba will refer to as countries being in crisis because of the non-respect of these constitutions. Before we proceed with this conversation, ladies and gentlemen, let's listen or watch this excerpt done for us by Buka Marumbe.
But the question is, does that in and of itself ensure that the men and women who are appointed to serve as judicial officers, do they have integrity simply because of that system of appointment? And remember, in many African countries, there are also several considerations to be taken into account. Beyond gender, which we now know, is that you want to have some kind of gender parity. There is also ethnicity. There are countries which their ethnicity is a factor. How do you create a regional balance? I'm sure that happens. Possibly here in Liberia, it happens in La Côte d'Ivoire. I don't know whether it happens in Morocco and other countries, but the whole idea that the face of the society must be represented in the constitution of the judiciary. How do you ensure that you achieve all that without undermining merit? Because merit is at the very heart of it. Some would argue that once you are qualified as a lawyer, then you have the merit. No, you can acquire a law degree, but you are mediocre. Because the mere possession of a law degree in and of itself is not sufficient. There is the need to know. That is why a friend of mine used to tell me that when a judge is appointed and you hear people saying, and who is that, then that one does not matter. A judge should be a person who, when he or she is appointed to say, people say, yes, the right decision. And I think that that is the beginning of the discussion about integrity. That as a person, when confronted with issues, when face to face, I think it is our native judge, Lord Acton, who used to say, that I fear judges who, on a mere confrontation, when face to face with the executive, become more executive-minded than the executive. And there are some judges, when face to face with the executive, they become more executive than the executive. They want to get what I call mind reading. What would the president do? What would the president think if I arrive at this decision? What will the president think of me? This happens particularly in constitutional election petitions. When judicial officers are called upon to determine whether an election has been held fairly or not, many judicial officers cower, and you wonder why they became judges in the first place. Integrity.
That was PLO Lumumba speaking at the International Conference of Judges. Now, like we mentioned, we are joined by Professor AKHUMBOM Anthony, who's our expert for today. Now, Prof, earlier on you mentioned that we've seen a lot of constitutional changes across the African continent. And it's in line with what Professor Lumumba says, because when you look at the current context on the African continent, we have several countries that over the years have had to change their constitutions, something you attribute to wanting to keep a particular individual or particular political party in power. Now, how does that affect the integrity of the African continent?
You see, primarily I will begin by saying that the problem is we shouldn't actually focus on the leaves or the fruits and abandon the source, which is the roots. The problem is if we are talking about constitutions today, these constitutions are actually a reflection of the borrowed democratic system that was brought from Europe, from the West. As a result of that, we are struggling to put a square peg in a round hole, and it's practically not going to be effective. And so that is the reason why from 1960s up to date, there are several coups d'etats that have taken place violating constitutions. There are several constitutional coups d'etats that have taken place violating constitutions because the so-called governing system that I want to use the founding fathers borrowed, which was actually imposed on them by the West, or their colonial masters. Such is the reason why it is practically difficult for those in power right now to say, okay, we are letting go. There was a period of time when they were enjoying the one-party system that permitted most of them to stay in power. And then later on, the West imposed on them again a multi-party system, which has caused more violence than had ever been before. As a result of that, some of them feel like they are supposed to remain on that seat. They don't see a reason why they should be there and leave.
Like it's a right, actually.
It's like a right to them. But that is in relation to the fact that the African is having Africans believe in strong men and not in strong institutions. And wanting to establish a strong institution, like I want to use the case of Ghana. If you go back in the 1980s, beg your pardon, something entered my eye. In 1980s, there's something that happened with Ghana. J.J. Rawlings, oh my God, J.J. Rawlings came to power through a coup d'etat.
Yes.
When he saw the way those who had actually taken power were mismanaging the resources of the nation, he was a little bit disturbed as a soldier. He has been trained to be a disciplined individual. The military trains you in discipline. And I will say this, it makes the military believes in establishing strong men who can control situations. It is true they follow the law because that is based on their the disciplinary order in which they have there. And you know what? When he took power, he realized that he was a soldier, so he doesn't want to rule. And so he preferred to give it back to a civilian. But he realized that they kept on with the same pattern of things. Corruption kept increasing. And what did he do this time around? He did not only seize power, he took power and he made sure he executed every corrupt leader that was in Ghana during that period. It created a situation where Ghanaians were everywhere. Hector running away because it created instability. And families actually suffered. But it took some time, over 20 years, to establish a strong institution, to establish stronger institutions that could actually govern the nation. And after that period, he handed over power, believing that he had a strong system. Then he stayed behind as an ex-president, watching the constitution work for the nation. Only at the same time, that same constitution, some of the guys who come after or who came after also learned how to play over the constitution and do what they want. But to an extent, the Ghanaian constitution stays above the reign of the leaders, the presidents, or say the politicians who come to power. The same thing, something similar happened in Nigeria. But when you look at what happened I saw the democratic establishment in Malawi. I was more, in fact, I was happy. I saw another in Zambia. I said, wow, this is good. And so those southern nations are actually trying to move closer towards democracy than it was before. But in most cases, in Central Africa, is a different case altogether. When you want to look at Central Africa, and let's talk of West Africa majorly, because when you go back to Ivory Coast, remember before the term of office mentioned in the constitution of the present president of Ivory Coast had elapsed before he manipulated the constitution again, then came into power. That was constitutional coup d'etat. And I think when he did that, the French were happy about it, that he stayed in power because he is their man. But I saw how the constitution was being violated in Mali, and by an individual, even though he still had his term of office, and the military came in, said they wanted to correct the situation and seize power. That was not a constitutional coup d'etat, but that was an open coup d'etat that violated the constitution of the country. In fact, they dissolved every institution that was established by that same constitution. And as a result of that, it was dangerous. The same thing happened in Burkina Faso. The same thing happened in Guinea. And recently, it just happened in Niger. That is to explain to us that Africans are not as we expect. The same thing happened in Sudan. Just of recent, it happened in
Gabon?
I want to talk of Chad.
Yeah.
And now the president, the so-called transitional president,
has been declared
decided to run for election, which on normal basis he was not supposed to participate in the election.
But the constitution that was amended in December actually permitted him to
who amended the constitution in December? That is to tell you, after the constitutional coup d'etat, the sea went further to touch the constitution in order to favor his reign in power. And recently, I discovered that Success yesterday declared he had won the election, and by 2 hours later, the body that is in control of elections came announcing that Debbie won the election by 61 point something %.
Absolutely.
Actually making it impossible for a second round to be possible. So it is disheartening that in Africa we cannot believe that the constitution can help put things in order. But like I said, the problem is not because Africans do not want to respect their constitution. It is simply because we believe in strong men and we want to establish monarchies. And I don't think that if Africans developed their own system of governance, we would have been having this problem that we are having right now.
Actually, you mentioned something about the issue of a monarchy, which I'll be coming back to it in the course of this program. But back to what Professor Lumumba cited, he said after the 1900s, and you actually took us back in your analysis to the 1960s. Now, he said after the 1900s, there was this breed of a new constitutional dispensation across the African continent, where we saw the Western world convince African countries that democracy was equal to, say, freedom of the press, civil society, and a host of others. Now, this, over the years, has led to the amendment of several constitutions, which you cited earlier on. And now with this, what accounts for these loopholes we're seeing in governance systems and the possible change in constitutions across Africa?
I already said that there's, first of all, let me try to go systematically. The primary thing about it is that inside of us, we do not believe in democracy as per the Western democratic system.
Absolutely.
We believe we need strong men who can hit their hands on the table and things change. We need those kind of men.
There's African culture and tradition.
And tradition actually adore the man, the warrior king, who is capable of directing issues and creating change. Those are the kind of people the Africans like. It is inside of us. And apart from that, Africans also took upon them the idea of democracy, which, according to what you just cited, brings freedom of free speech, freedom of whatsoever. So it is liberty, which they are seeking for. The question is, were Africans not free before? They were always free. What was the thing that was stopping them from becoming anything? You see, when Europeans came to Africa with ethnocracy, in fact, they used their ethnocentric way of judging our culture. They wanted to measure the African culture to be equivalent to the European culture, but it could not be possible because Africa is found in the southern hemisphere, while Europe is found in the northern hemisphere. It means that there are two different environments. And secondly, the culture in which our ancestors developed was practically different from what their ancestors developed. And in coming into Africa to colonize Africa, first of all, to make Africa a slave land for them, where they could get free labor and later on free resources, they came in for colonization. They thought that, okay, we need to continuously keep these people under our yoke so that we can keep controlling them. So what do you need to give them that will control them? You need to kill their culture, destroy it, and then give them what they will not be able to handle so that you can always be there to correct. And since most of those who were placed in leadership positions within our continent were individuals who were actually raised with the European mindset. They were children that were picked up, trained the European way, educated the European way, and then brought in as the big man and placed in seats of our nations, claiming that they were giving us independence. And on that period of saying they were giving us independence, they were actually placing an individual where that it will be a black man sitting with under a white mask. This black man will be the one to do the biddings of the Westerners, and you will blame the black man because he is the one you are seeing
acting behind.
Yes. So at this, what will be that thing that would the instrument which they are going to use? Democracy. Democracy is the instrument. And today we are all saying, oh, democracy, we are Democrats, we want this, we want that. African democracy is different from Western democracy. African development is supposed to be different from European development. You see, the moment you struggle to measure anything about Africa with Europe, you are making a mistake, because we have different cultural values. And as long as we have different cultural values, that is the very foundation, the root of who we are, which is different from who Europeans are. The reason why I have black skin, and I want to be sincere in telling you this, it was not a mistake that most of us, the black people, were born in Africa and scattered across the world. I want to be sincere in telling you that the blacks that you find in Europe today, they do not necessarily migrate. They were picked out of Africa and carried to Europe. Those you found in most of Southern American countries were picked out of Africa and transported there. And that created a situation. The black man, wheresoever he is, necessarily have not abandoned the root of who he is. Go all over the world. That is why they are struggling to fit in the various systems in which they are found in, and it's practically difficult for them to cope. And most of the times when the European wants to measure the success of a black man, he measures his success with you. I believe that my concepts are different from that of the Westerner, and therefore my concepts should determine my output. It is a man's concepts and philosophies that determines his output, the result of your life. So when you want us to work with constitutions that are borrowed, constitutions that are not indigenous, you do not expect that the people should not break them. And so at the end of the day, they will not respect it because it is not reflecting their very internal person.
Yes.
And that is very dangerous for a continent. That means we will stay in this particular state of stagnancy for long, because until we define our very own destiny based on our own concepts and values, we will remain in one place. The copy and paste we have done is not going to carry Africa out of the bondage in which it finds itself right now. You see, we are talking about constitution, and we should be looking at the judiciary. Who are those who appoint judges in Africa? Based on the constitution, the president, the executive should do that appointment. But if you look at, it is supposed to be a ceremonial responsibility. When he does it, appointing a judge, he is not above the judge.
Yeah, that is true.
The judge is supposed to be independent from him. But you realize that in most cases in Africa, when the executive appoints the judge is submissive to the executive. And at the end of the day, the so-called constitutional power of the judiciary disappears. It's consumed by the executive. And as a result of that, we find a situation where there is conflict of power. And when there is conflict of power, who appointed you? The judge cannot go above the neck In fact, the neck can go above the head.
That's where we have this issue of the lack of will of law
yes,
in the country.
I'm still coming to that because that's the last thing I needed to say concerning the question you asked me. The willpower to liberate these particular powers who liberate the various arms is not there because they need to be in control of issues. Like I said earlier, we believe in strong men, and so when they come to power, they want to be the strong men. Unfortunately, not everybody is fit to be a strong man. Some people come and they are weak, and that is why the country keeps going down, going draining. In fact, is completely getting down. Everything is disappearing, and corruption is skyrocketing. And like I said to somebody yesterday, it's unfortunate that Africa is finding it practically difficult to control corruption because it is now in the fabrics of our personalities, and you can find corruption everywhere in the community. So from where will you start fighting? You want to fight the government officials and forget about the taxi driver on the way who is giving 500 to the policeman and the policeman who is asking for it. You fight school teachers who are actually asking children to give them money so that they can give them pass marks. Just go everywhere. There is corruption right now, and we need to be able to put things in order. But if we had the right governance system with the right kind of constitution, we will not have this kind of problems.
Exactly. If we have the right institutions, we're not going to have the problem of this violation of constitutions across Africa. Meanwhile, you earlier on cited that Africa needs strong men and leadership. Leadership is all about, it surrounds around wisdom. I believe you're going to agree with me on that. But then we've seen Africa get to a place where it's trying to liberate itself. We've seen a revolution ongoing across the African continent in a bid for Africa to actually get back its own identity. But when we're looking at Africa's destiny and what democracy is actually, when you look at all this concepts and all the everything that surrounds it, if I may put it that way, how, as an African man, as a Pan-Africanist, I'm probably a member of civil society, how are you going to define democracy in the African context?
If you want me to define, I will not want to define democracy because I don't think that I'll give a right definition for it, because it's a concept that the Greeks came up with, which they had their policy of the people ruling the people. In fact, power should be that of the people and not that of individuals. And the truth is, Africa is a different concept with Africa. The power was never from the people, it's from somewhere. There's somebody who is at the top and the people are there.
The different powers we're talking about.
So in Africa before, let's say in the 19th century, so let's even go back as far as before the white man stepped foot in Africa, in the 14th centuries, 15th centuries, you realize that what was working in Africa was also kind of, there were monarchies.
Yes, kingdoms,
kings, monarchies,
fawns, and you name the rest.
I know, I still want to say that I think Europeans deceived Africa for long, because till today as we are talking, Great Britain is still a monarchy. It's true they call it a constitutional monarchy. Spain is still a monarchy.
That's true.
If you, I need us to go around, you realize Belgium is still a monarchy. So there are still many monarchies in Europe,
but there are few in
Africa. Why? When they came with their colonial agenda, they realized that if they had to permit Africa to stay with their monarchic system, they will not have easy control over Africa. So don't forget, Democracy as developed as we are struggling to use today came from the Americas, the United States, which was a new country that was created by Westerners. When the Westerners from Great Britain and other parts of Europe gathered, crossed the sea, Atlantic Ocean, settled over in North America, they created their country in somebody's continent, somebody's backyard, and decided to come up with this governance system to test. It was a test which on normal basis has failed. I mean, democracy has failed in the United States. Democracy has failed all over the world. It will not succeed in Africa. In the United States today, if it is the same constitution that they are using, I'm sure they have also violated their own constitution, because they interpret their constitutions based on what they want, based on their values. And just imagine that they are struggling to impose those same values on Africa, and you are willing to accept it, to say you are a democratic person. No, I will not accept to be democratic, knowing that the values that they have are contrary to my manner of living. And as an African, I'll be sincere in saying that African democracy has failed because it is Western democracy in Africa.
So how do we get to a point where Africans can look for a system of governance that applies to the continent?
You see, it would depend on who takes power. Because at the moment, we still have constitutions that tells us we need to go for elections, which are democratic, even though they are not being respected to the latter, but to an extent, they want to hold some the clauses on it so that they should know that they are respecting it. And so they say there's going to be election. For example, we are using Cameroon. There's going to be election in 2025. Mm-hmm. There was an election that just took place recently in Chad, on the 6th, and one just recently took place in Senegal. You want to go around. There are different elections that are taking place. Who takes power matters. Exactly. You can take power if you have the constitutional majority of legislators. You can change the constitution completely and put something else. We come up with a different governance system, but that will also mean we need visionary leaders. As long as there are no visionary leaders, there is no possibility to create such. That is what was happening in Libya, where the Libyan leader,
Muammar
Gaddafi, he never called himself a president because he never saw himself as a president. That's why I would say Africa does not need rulers, Africa needs leaders. When Gaddafi took power, he refused to be the president of his country. He chose to be their leader. A leader is a visionary. He gives a vision. The people might not be seeing it, but he is willing to take them there. And gradually he is carrying them towards that place and showing them how glorious that particular destiny is. So, if you are not a visionary, you can't actually bring that kind of transformation Gaddafi brought. And if you look at it, most of the dreams that Gaddafi had for Africa, because he was not only thinking of Gaddafi, he took his time, built the kind of utopia that he wanted for Africa in his country. He created the kind of Africa he wanted in his country. And till today, after his death, I will still tell you, Libya is one of those countries in the world with a high per capita income. Why? If Gaddafi was a dictator, as the West indicated, he would have soaked in all the wealth of the country into himself and used it for his personal good while the people suffer. But Libyans were not suffering because they were enjoying free everything. And that was a vision. And this visionary wanted a united Africa. A united Africa with with a single currency, no borders and all that. That was a visionary. Do we have such visionaries in most of our countries sitting in power? No. We have greedy individuals who are sitting in power and deceiving citizens, claiming that we are democracy, manipulating the constitution to keep themselves in power, not doing anything for the good of the people. And that is why I want to use Cameroon right now. Cameroon is one of those nations in the world that is supposed to be the leading nations in the world. It has all the raw materials, it has all the natural resources, and then above all, it has a great dimension of human resources. Cameroon has one of the most educated group of people, and its diaspora is strong, well educated. But what is happening? We have a system that truncates development. We have a system that is bottlenecked, and as a result of that, you do not expect growth. You do not expect progress. Why? They use the so-called constitution that were put in place to keep on perpetuating their stay in power, and the truth is there's nothing you can do against them because they will tell you they are democratic.
Exactly. Those are some of the challenges, like you said, your bottlenecks, some of the challenges that are actually hindering progress, hindering development of every nation and consequently the African continent. Now, we're looking at, like we mentioned, we have been reiterating over the course of this edition that these constitutions do not reflect the real identity of the African people. But could these be a Western agenda, which is what you agree with?
Yeah.
Or it was put in place, these different powers actually are bringing in these constitutions that do not reflect the ideologies of the African people, because they are trying to, it's not about revamping what already exists on the continent, it's about reshaping or binding them down so they cannot be able to get to that point of realization which they intend to attain.
You see, I wrote a book on Africa's dilemma.
Yes.
And in that book, I was so categorical about this issue. Before the Westerners came to Africa, Africa had every institution needed to keep Africa moving ahead. Question: why didn't they come and empower it? Why did they come and did everything possible to wipe away Africans' history? Don't forget, civilization actually started in this continent.
Exactly, that is true.
And that cannot in any way be taken away from Africa. And if that cannot be taken, then there is a problem with Africans trying to think that the West needs to educate them on what they need in leadership. The West do not and does not have any leadership one that they can use to conjure our path. And so it is for us Africans to choose the path we want and build it. But if we have to do it, we have to go back to the past. You can't build on another man's concept and have an original. You always and only have a photocopy. And so I don't want to be an imitator. I don't want to be a second. Being an African, I'm supposed to be the original. And so I think for Africa to make a difference, we need to go back to the past. What was happening in Africa before the white man came? Was there a judiciary? Yes. Was there an army? Yes. Was there the executive? Yes. Was there a legislative? Yes. Which implies the African before colonization had a democracy, which is different from what we are having, the Western democracy that is sucking dry the continent right now. You see, people like PLO Lumumba that you just mentioned, they have been trained in the Western ways of looking at the law. But I like his way of reasoning. But if you hear him talk about constitutions are being violated, yeah, it's because he believes what is now can help Africa, but I don't think it can help.
Well, he even cited that Africans or the Westerners are using ideologies. He mentioned LGBTQ to actually enslave, what he mentioned like tying the Africans down.
But those are some of the values I mentioned earlier that I can't accept a value that does not tie with my inner person.
Exactly what he was saying.
You want Africa to be like Europe. Africa is not Europe. Europe is not Africa. the fact that they colonized Africa does not necessarily mean that they should they should define the destiny of Africa. They don't have the capacity. They do not have the power to define our destinies. And that is why when you see the rise that Africans are rising, the coup d'etats that took place in Burkina Faso, Niger, their interest is to take back power for themselves. They believe that they want to define their own destinies. And that is what Africa needs. Define its own destiny using its own means.
And its identity.
For you to have a destiny, you must be able to go back to the root cause. Your culture. Your culture is the very root of your identity. You can't talk of identity without culture. Absolutely. And so, the cultural values we inculcate do not in any way correspond with the Western values that are brought to us. You can't sit and tell me, as a man, we are claiming that the Europeans brought the Bible to Africa. Religion started in Africa, never started anywhere. I want to say it and reiterate. Religion started in Africa. The belief in a deity started in Africa, not started in Europe. And the concepts were developed here by our ancestors. They only borrowed and they created other things out of it. Today we talk of Christianity, we talk of Islamism, we talk of whatsoever. But before that, the African traditional religion has always been in place. And the funny thing about the African traditional religion is that it's not passed to you using a textbook. There's nothing written anywhere, but the people practice it because the values are transmitted through their culture. And that is why the African man is indigenously very religious, and I'll say this with all boldness, very spiritual. And so you can't in any way think that when you come and tell us that if I'm a man, I'm supposed to have a relationship with a man, and I'll accept, because that will already make me an animal. In fact, animals are better than that. I don't think a male dog will want to go having intercourse definitely with a male dog. It's not possible. And where are human beings coming from? A human being is born a lady, he gets up tomorrow and says he's a male. A human being born a female gets up. Is that not showing you that there's something wrong with the Western culture? It has failed. And if it has failed, they shouldn't impose it on Africa. And the Africans that are accepting it are stupid in themselves. So, sorry for saying that, but I think that if you accept stupidity, you are stupid.
So actually, those are some of the assaults which Africa is facing. Meanwhile, we have the will of law, which actually is something that might be hindering the constitutions of the African continent. But we've seen this continued interference with all the points you have cited so far. Those are what is used by the Western powers or different powers which the Pan-African activists will cite are being used to control the African. And now you mentioned something. Every nation and the African continent will have there are 3 arms, and I would like to quote the media as the 4th arm.
Yeah.
With all these arms, actually, you said the judiciary does have a very key role to play. But with all the challenges the African continent is facing, you mentioned Africa still needs to choose its own identity, needs to go back to its roots and actually take a firm stance with regards to how it intends to get out of the shackles. With all this in place, why do we have this continued interference on the continent, and how can Africa actually break loose from this in a bid to actually stand firm and lead to its own development?
You see, it is something very easy to understand. Europeans never came to Africa to leave Africa. They came to remain. They wanted to take it over. That was their original plan, to take over Africa. Because, you see, it has been for more than 300 centuries. I mean, talk of over 3 centuries. Let me even say 5 centuries. That they have been exploiting Africa, but the resources are not going anywhere. So, don't you think if you are a Westerner, you will do everything to stamp out Africans and take over? Because if you need raw materials for your industry. Africa has all the necessary raw materials. Today we are using phones produced by cobalt. You know, you use cobalt, right, to produce phones. The highest producer of cobalt is Congo Democratic.
Yeah.
And that's why the country is placed in a constant unstable position, so that they can enjoy the resources. The Westerners are enjoying the resources. When you come to Niger, was one of the most, in fact, it's one of the nations that have the highest degree of uranium.
Mm-hmm.
And do you realize that they were producing uranium, but the nation never had electricity?
They actually get electricity from Nigeria, which the country says is going to cut.
So the question is, why should you produce uranium and you don't have electricity? And who was benefiting from it?
That is a question, actually.
The French. The French were benefiting from it. They were the ones who were actually doing the extortion of it. And if you see all that, why do you think that in the 14 African nations that French is spoken in, controlled by the French, why is it that they are the most underdeveloped countries in Africa? That's just to pass you an information. You want Africans to change? You want Africans to make progress? You want to know why nothing is moving? They are in one position. And you think that the constitutions that is the constitution that's going to help them? Constitutions will never give them any way out, because those constitutions were not written for our good. And who wrote them? What for? How were they written? Which knowledge did we use about our past to write those constitutions? Nothing. And so, at the end of the day, I feel disappointed being an African, but I am an African. And I need to be proud in taking the leap and say, I need change for myself. When the former president, Idris Deby of Chad, was killed, and his son came and seized power. What was that? That was a violation of the Constitution, because the Constitution said the Speaker of the House was supposed to take over, then prepare an election. But he seized power, and he was applauded by the French. Why? It was for the good of the French, not for the good of Africa. And that's why there is no way that any other person is going to win an election in Chad than Idris Deby's son. Because at the moment as we are talking, he is working for the French. It's not an accusation. It's something that is visible on the ground. And go to Niger. The former president was just a puppet of the French, because you can't be in power. Your nation is having you supply uranium to the world, and your people are suffering. They don't have electricity, and you are doing nothing about it. A constitutional violation took place again, because a coup d'etat took place. The same thing in Mali, the same thing in Burkina Faso. What is happening? Do you know in Guinea, the person who was supposed to come in fact, I think he already was in power, something like that. He was going for the third term.
What's that?
Huh?
No, right?
No, he was not. He was not going for the third term. It is because, yes, he was already the third time. That was his third term in office. Before Dimboya came in and seized power. But who was he working for? It is because the president of Guinea spoke against the French stronghold on Africa, and he said he's breaking out.
Yeah, that has always been the trend when leaders go against those that have put them in power.
Good.
They are being ousted.
How did Deby die? After Deby ran and campaign and won an election declaring he is going to cut off from the French. It didn't take long, he was killed. So, who are we supposed to blame? Those sitting at the helm of our nations? Yes, I blame them, but I don't put 100% blame on them.
While we're blaming them, could you also say that we're always talking about looking for African solutions to African problems, but we forget to understand that while you're within the circle, some Africans, it's not an accusation, but some Africans could be at the center of the problem that is going on. So how do we solve that problem?
As I just said, I am going to blame those who are sitting as we have. I'm blaming them partially, and I'm not blaming them again. Why? When you sit in power and you are doing the biddings of another person, it means you don't love your people. You don't. Even if you are afraid to be killed, it's good to die a hero than to die a coward.
Absolutely.
If you choose to allow them to control you and control your people, then you are a coward. You want to live peacefully and enjoy big. You are the only lone fat man eating well while your citizens are suffering, and you are claiming to be a leader. You are a failure. And it happens that I will also not want to blame them, because most of the times their lives are under threat. And every human being to an extent is a coward, because sometimes we are afraid to die. The truth is we want to go to heaven, but we don't want to die. And so in that aspect, they can be given a part out. But I believe, being an African, we shouldn't in any way allow anyone to sit and control us. We need to tell them enough is enough. We do what is right. We work for our people. We define the cause for our people's destinies, not for foreigners. If you want to tell us what to do, tell your people to do what is right for them. We will do what is right for us. We can have a mutual relationship and not a father-son relationship. When they come to Africa, they want to bring dictatorship. If you listen to what Chichekezi of the DRC said the other time, he said it's like when Chinese and the Chinese come to Africa, they play a little bit different, and Russia, they play different. They don't come giving us instructions, they don't come wanting to be our fathers. And it means they can stay more in Africa than the Westerners. So when the Westerners come, what do? They want to dictate. They want to tell you. Just imagine a Macron who come to Africa, a baby, who come and want to tell his elder brothers, and because he is from the country which colonized us, tell them you need to do this, you need to do that. Who gave them the capacity and the audacity to dictate on us? And so those are some of the things that I think needs to be put under the carpet. We need to get to that place where we take over our power.
Absolutely. Africa needs to get to a point where it can take its own decisions. Africa needs to get to a point where it can be able to pick what is right for its people. Ladies and gentlemen, if you're just joining us, this is Talking Point over your #1 Pan-African channel for you, Media Africa, where we're discussing how different powers are assaulting the constitution of the African people. Of course, we are discussing this with our guests here in the studio with us this afternoon, Professor AKHUMBOM Mark Anthony, who is a Pan-Africanist. He doubles as a civil society activist, a writer, and more. Meanwhile, you are listening to us over the airways of FM 96.3. We're streaming live on YouTube. So, like we mentioned in the course of this program, Africans, we have reiterated that Africa needs what we call a good governance system for it to be able to thrive. But still, we have this problem that some Africans, there is this problem of the respect of law, the respect of the rule of law. So with all this concepts when put in place, how do Africa revamp its, say, governance systems that will actually apply to the current status, to the current context of the continent, one that is in transition towards revolution?
You know, the first thing I want before I answer your question is we have a group of Africans who call themselves the Enlightened. And they are the first people who stand up and tell you, oh, going back to the African model is archaic, because they have been brainwashed. They have been brainwashed to an extent where they do not know the difference between who they are and who the stranger is. In fact, they don't know who they are. And as long as you are in a state of unconsciousness, it is possible for anybody to control you. And sincerely, most Africans are in a state of unconsciousness. So there is a need for an awakening. And until there is an awakening, there is no possibility for you to experience any change. There will be no progress. Africans are in that place where they are sleeping. They are walking unconsciously, doing things unconsciously, living an unconscious life, and expecting for change to come consciously. It's not possible. And so there is need for an awakening, a reawakening within the African. You see, it is when you awaken to self-realization that you start producing true results that reflect your identity.
Yeah.
Without that, there is no possibility for any true result. Everything you'll be doing will be a copy and paste. You know why I'm saying this? The educational systems that we have are archaic European educational system implanted in Africa to indoctrine Africans. Education is not supposed to be for the purpose of indoctrinating, but Africans are being indoctrinated with an educational system that makes them become so wayward, makes them become so stupid, makes them become so careless, brainwashed to an extent where they do not even see the path towards progress. And so you do not expect that people who are sleeping should be able to give direction to themselves. And so there is need for an awakening within Africa. Africans get to rise, because without that, there's no progress. So if you ask me how they can manage to come out, to shape a destiny for themselves, to transition to that kind of leadership that we are talking about, it is not going to be easy. It's going to be, and it's not going to be something that is happening, going to happen now, because like I mentioned, we have the so-called brainwashed, enlightened Africans who say the old system is archaic. Why do you call it archaic when you have not revamped it? Why do you call it archaic when you go back to it, take the concept, rework on it? Because I'll be sincere. The problem is we have been made to believe that our developmental plan is supposed to be the Western developmental plan.
That is true.
But you cannot give a definition of development from an African perspective and it will fit with that of a European. Why? Because development to an African is necessarily not what development is to a Westerner. And if you realize, to the West, development means cutting down trees and building houses, placing high skyscrapers, breaking down roads, streets, and trees, and placing streets and roads and train stations. And at the end of the day, they create global warming, and then they come to us and tell us, you need to protect the environment. Who has been protecting the environment since? Africans do not know how to do that. And if you go back, look at what development is. Development necessarily is not supposed to be about your environment. It's supposed to be about you. And when a person has actually developed, what happens is the results are reflected in his environment. They are reflected. But when you are underdeveloped and you want to develop your environment, what will you do? You will do copy and paste. And so that is where we have a problem. So if you want Africans to define a path for themselves, become those kind of leaders, then there should be a true definition of what development is. You must define who you are, develop yourself, become mature and conscious of who you are, and at that moment you can truly give direction to the people. Because if you have not hit the light, you will remain in the darkness. And that is what is happening with Africa. We have not hit the light. And do you remember that around the 15th century, there's something that happened in Europe called the reawakening, a renaissance?
Yes.
What was that? A group of people came to light. They hit the light. And it resulted to what? Industrial revolution. But why is it that Africa has not been able to hit that? Because we have been misoriented. We have been misoriented by the West. And we are struggling to live the lives of Westerners, their vision of who we are, instead of living our vision of who we are. And that is terrible, because it is a prison, an open prison which we have been placed in. As long as you are in prison up here, even if you are free walking out there, you are worse than an individual that is locked up in a cell. And so Africa needs to go back to where they can reshape themselves. They build the concepts of who they are, identify with themselves. Then they can truly give a development to the external world. But if that concept of development is not changed from within, it won't produce an effective result outside. And so Africa needs to reawaken.
Africa needs to reawaken. And now you mentioned the issue of the education system, which is no news, because we have been evoking this over time in the course of this program on several occasions. And now, how can Africa revamp? In a bit for televiewers or listeners that had not heard this before, what does Africa need to revamp its education system, one that it's not just meant for or to please the global eye, but one that is in line with the context and the reality of the African continent?
The first thing is the concept of education has three facets from which you can actually look at and define it. The concept of education has the basic and the true aspect of education has to do with awakening an individual to self-produce, us, bringing you to a state where you can start realizing yourself. It is not indoctrinating. Then the other aspect of it is indoctrinating an individual to fit in a community that, you see, that is the kind of education that the West brought to us, where they indoctrinate you to fit in a mold. But you are not supposed to fit in a mold. Nobody is supposed to fit in a mold. You're supposed to be yourself. But they came with an educational system that permits you to fit in the mold. And once you are in the mold, it means you are in the system. You are controlled by the system. You do what the system wants you to do. You produce the results the system wants you to produce. And that is the reason why they have created what we call the formal educational system, where you need to get up in the morning. There is a classroom where you are going to sit for you to be educated, for you to be indoctrinated. But the primary educational system, that the system that I said, which is first of all awakening an individual for the purpose of self-realization, that does not need a classroom. It does not need a classroom. And then you have the third aspect, which is the vocational, which has to do with you learning skills.
Yes.
That is a different thing. So you have education in three different levels. And what is supposed to make you become a genius is what has been abandoned from our educational system. You are genius. Every African, every individual can be a genius if you are awakened from inside to tap into your potentials. You can realize a lot. But that is what we have been blocked from getting. And so you have been indoctrinated to fit in the mold so that you can become a slave to the system. And Africans have become slaves to the system. And we are doing everything possible to empower the West. Just imagine, they brought school to you, right? You have to go to school. You get up in the morning. Instead of being trained like in the African system where the school was a part of the daily life. You don't need a particular classroom to go and sit in. You are being trained with the system. In fact, you are trained by the culture. You are trained by the environment. You are trained by the people around you.
Like an African proverb goes, it says, it takes a village to raise a child.
And so you are not trained in a classroom, but anytime a child is taken away from the family setting and placed in an isolated individual, in an isolated environment for the purpose of education, that education has a motive. And what is that motive? To indoctrinate that child against the family. And as a result of that, that child will no more grow with the family ideologies. The child grows with the foreign ideologies. And that is what the West came and did to us. And when they did that, we were happy and we are copying it and we are actually putting it into place. And as a result of that, we want to produce results, but no, we are forming people that needs to go work for Europe. That is the reason why every day they keep crossing the borders. Every day they keep going across the Mediterranean Sea. Every day they are dying in deserts because they want to go to where they were trained to walk. They were not trained to work in Africa.
Okay, Prof, sorry to cut you short, but I'm coming back to you. Just got indications that I'll have a caller online. Greetings, Mrs. Sedi. Welcome on board to Ride On with your contribution.
Cut you short, but I'm coming back to you. Just got indications that I'll have a caller online.
Yeah, Mr. Sedi, are you with us?
Hello. Good afternoon, madam. Good afternoon, Prof. Guys. I think this professor, all my respects. Let me tell you that you have already said all the things that I want to say, and it seems that you enter in my body and bring out anything that I would like to say. May God bless you. I have never known before that there is somebody who will tell you exactly what I want. Anyhow, I have something to add because, you know, our problem in Africa is when we met Europeans. This is the only problem that we have. When they are talking about development in which regard? This development, why are we not developing? Is it because we don't resemble Europeans, Americans that we are not developing, or developing in which way? We have to come back, Africa, we have to come back to our ancestral way. When they met our ancestors at that time, we were developing. And let me remind you that the richest man at that time is from Mali, Mansa Musa, is from Mali. Why can they say that we are not developing? Is when they came in African land and they started stealing, teasing, and jeopardizing us, that we forget everything. Now we want to resemble developing weapons, our army, economically, everywhere we want to resemble. And the way that they are taking is not a normal way. See, the way they are behaving, even animals, even animals are better than them. I'm not insulting them, it's just a kind of remark. How can a man go with another man? How can a girl or a woman go with another girl or another woman? How can we imagine that it is possible today that we will support this kind of thing? Africans have to think and come back to where our ancestors have abandoned. Where our ancestors have abandoned all what we have as practice, traditions, and everything here in Africa, and join Europeans in their way of thinking. So I would like to call every president here or every authority to know that if we don't come back to our ancestors, we never get development, because even our ancestors don't agree with what we are doing and our behaving, and we have to know exactly that we need to come back to Africa. We need to come back to Africa, think our own system, think our educational system, think our economical system, and think even our financial and health system, because we need it. This is how, and that is the way we will get a development. Thank you very much, Madam NJIX. And once again, I would like to thank very, very much this professor, because he is, let me say, he is the best, the top of the top. May God bless you, Professor, for your television and overview of the world.
Thank you,
Only God is
Mr.
great.
Sedi. Thank you so much. It's always a pleasure having you on the program. Thank you, Mr. Sedi, who called us all the way from Benin. And now, do you share some opinion as our caller?
You see, it has always been of my opinion that we can't actually develop using a foreign concept, like I said earlier here.
Yes.
If you want to develop, was Africa an isolated land before? Was it a continent where nothing was happening in it before the West came and things started working? No. I might want to shock you, which is you might know what I'm saying, but I want to shock you and the world that civilization actually started in Africa. And if civilization started in Africa, it means every concept that is developed today in the world and used was developed in this continent. And if it was developed in this continent, it means that our ancestors had a vision, and there was a way they were looking at things. And so the question is, why not go back to the past to truly study the past and not only replicate it, but improve on it? What made these guys to think the way they think? I still have a problem with a lot of Africans forgetting to know that the Westerners have no possibility to remove the pyramids that are happening in Egypt right now and carry them to Europe. If there was a possibility, they would have removed them.
Yes.
And in order to deceive Africans, when you go to Egypt, for a lot of people who do not know history, the Arabians that are found in Egypt right now, those are not Africans. Let me tell you, give you a short history of what you call Egypt today. When the Kemet civilization was envied by the Assyrians, there was an Assyrian attack that took place around the 700 BC, which actually caused a kind of, should I say, serious migration into the interior of the continent. After that particular envy, there was the Kushites, which are Sudanese, left, went to conquer Egypt still to defeat those Assyrians that were there, took over. After that, it happened that Alexander the Great, around the 300 BC, came again with a serious group of soldiers, defeated this Egypt, then established himself like a pharaoh. In fact, he wanted to be a pharaoh. It was not possible because a foreigner can never be a pharaoh. But he stayed there, took over, till when he left, went to India and died on the way, that Ptolemy sat there as a pharaoh. That was no more the normal Egypt. The Greeks had already migrated into Africa and seized Alexandria, created their city. Alexandria was after the name of Alexander. It was a seaport, a nation, a city that's having a port. That's where he entered, and he created his capital there. And furthermore, that was not the only conquest. The Romans later on came, conquered that same Egypt. That was during call that her name what? I've forgotten that her name is a lady who was also claiming to be the last pharaoh of Africa, of Egypt. She was conquered, and at the end of the day, the Romans took over Egypt and it became their colony. And so the influx of Westerners was normal into Africa during that period. Until in the 7 BC, 7 AD, I beg you, 7th century AD of our time, that the Arabians who came spreading their Islamism conquered that same Egypt again. This time they did not conquer to go out, they conquered and imposed themselves there.
So Africans need to actually get back to their roots,
yes,
and retrace their history. Yes.
And being there, that was not the last conquest. The Turks also came again around the 14th century to still conquer that same Egypt. And so you see Egypt, as we are talking right now, is having a mixed group of people. You have Arabians, you have Turks, you have Africans, all there, Europeans, all inside Egypt because of this. So it is not like Egypt was, because when they see the civilization now, those pyramids were built 4,000 years, or let me say 3,000 years before this conquest started. Mm-hmm. And who are those who built? They were built by our ancestors. They were built by a Bantu like me, a black man like me. If you go back, I can give you that history if you like. And as a result of that, you don't get up and think that more because they say Egypt is different. No, Egypt is only different because they came and seized it in order to steal away your history from you so that you should not know the truth about yourself. And the same thing, some people, if South Africa, if they succeeded in taking the southern part of Africa because they saw the great Zimbabwean war civilization, they were looking for a way to wipe it and say it was a foreign thing. And then they brought in Europeans to place in Southern Africa. They wanted to annihilate blacks from Southern Africa, but that could not be possible. So the whites you see here, they were brought in from the West.
So with all this you have mentioned, Africa, it's a time for reawakening. It's a time for you to reconscientize yourself and, of course, realize that the continent or the interest of the continent is first and foremost. Now, Professor AKHUMBOM, in a bit to wrap up today's edition, just in a few words, a take-home message to our televiewers and listeners.
Okay, thank you very much. I want my brothers and sisters, Africans watching at me wheresoever you are, I think it is time for us to get to reawaken. A lot of Africans have been brainwashed. You have been feeding on the concepts that do not reflect your true personality. And so I think it is time for you to get back to yourself. You see, everything about humanity is standing on the base of spirituality, and as long as you are not spiritually awakened, you can never physically be awakened. And so I am calling on Africans to go back, visit their past. You need to reawaken. There's need for you to touch the African soil, connect back to the past, revive your inner person and become the real African. And I will tell you this, it doesn't need you to go become a religious fanatic for you to become a spiritually awakened. No, that's not what I'm saying. You need to be spiritually awakened, but that will mean that you need to touch your inner person. The God you are seeking for is not in heaven somewhere. The heaven is inside of you. It's not somewhere else that you need to look for. He's inside of you. And that is why even when you go read the Bible, which the Christians use, it says that the kingdom of God is within you. Within you is not outside of you. So if you want to touch the God that needs to create the war you want, get back inside. The war we want to see is what we are going to create. But if you choose to stay, experience it with your eyes and not go back to touch it from inside, you will never create the war. So
Absolutely.
if we are talking of African developmental plan, that plan, we are the only people who can define it, and we cannot define it now unless we are awakened.
Exactly. Africa, you had it all. That was Professor AKHUMBOM. Mark Anthony, thank you for your insight on today's edition.
The pleasure is all mine. You're welcome. Africa, it's time to awake.
Thank you, ladies and gentlemen, for your keen attention and, of course, for watching today's edition of the program. We say I'll take the rendezvous for Monday next week. Meanwhile, do stay in company and do have a great weekend in company for numerous transmissions.